Good morning, everyone, and welcome. The topic of today's online event is bioecology's influence on agriculture, a path to sustainability. My name is Brandy Yanchik, and I am an independent journalist and documentary filmmaker who is based in Edmonton, Alberta, which is in Treaty 6 territory. I'd like to acknowledge the diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footprints have marked this territory for centuries, such as the Nehayao, Cree, Dene, Anishinaabe, Saulteaux, Nakota Ishka, Nakota Sioux, Niitsitapi, Blackfoot peoples. I also acknowledge this as the Métis homeland and the home of one of the largest communities of Inuit south of the 60th parallel. Before I introduce today's panelists, a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you're having difficulties hearing the webinar at any time today, or you are experiencing an unreliable internet signal, you can always use the call-in number included in your webinar registration email, or by clicking the arrow next to the microphone icon and pressing switch to phone audio. Now, there is a box labeled Q&A. This is where you can pose your questions to the panelists. If you see a question in the Q&A box that you think is important to ask, you can also click the thumbs up icon on the question to move it to the front of the queue. We will also have a couple of poll questions for you. Today's event will consist of the presentations by our panelists, followed by some questions after each presentation. We will then have a panel discussion around the topic. Please be aware that this event is being recorded, and the recording will be uploaded to YouTube, and you will receive the link in an email along with the post-event survey. We will be taking clips from the video and posting these on social media. We do hope that today's event promotes more discussion with a broad diversity of participants. Today, I am joined by two distinguished speakers for this discussion. Paul Galpern is an associate professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Calgary, and Marcus Boguet is an associate professor at the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Culture at the University of Oslo. Welcome. Now, before we begin, I have a poll question for the audience. As of last year, a plan has been put in place to protect more than 5,000 square kilometers of prairie grasslands, about 6 times the size of Calgary. Which of these statements about the prairie grasslands is true? The prairie grasslands, A, hold soil in place, prevent erosion. B, retain and filter water. C, store carbon in extensive root systems. D, are found often in working ranches and cattle operations. Or E, all of the above. You have 1 minute to answer the poll, after which we will display the results. Okay, the poll is ending. We're just waiting for those results, and we have them. Interesting. Okay, so 0% of participants think prairie grasslands hold soil in place and prevent erosion. 0% of participants think that prairie grasslands retain and filter water. 3% of participants say grasslands store carbon in extensive root systems. And D, 0% of participants think that prairie grasslands are found often in working ranches and cattle operations. Aha. And what do we have here? 97% of participants say all of the above. And the answer to the Zoom poll is all of the above. Good work, everybody. The extensive root systems of prairie grasslands hold soil in place. They store and filter water, which helps improve water quality and prevent both floods and droughts. Carbon stored in the grasslands isn't threatened by wildfires as much as carbon stored in forests. And grasslands are often protected and managed by farmers and ranchers in working cattle operations. I now want to invite Paul to start the discussion. Now, as you listen to his presentation, can you please think of some questions that you'd like to ask him and put them in the Q&A box? In your question, please tell us your name and a bit about yourself, such as your location and your profession.
Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be invited to speak today, and it's also a great pleasure to discover the excellent background knowledge that our participants have about the value of prairie grasslands. I want to start today just by giving a very brief introduction to how I see the cropping on the Canadian prairies today. You're seeing an image of an intensive landscape. This is a shot from the air in Saskatchewan, and you can see canola in bloom. There's likely wheat and barley, perhaps pulses growing there, and it's a carpet almost entirely of annual crops. And it's been designed that way because this is an industrialized landscape. And it's been that way for at least a century, where the crop is produced, and then we have the means of getting that from across this hinterland to market. And it's a business as well, and it's a business with risks. And farmers increasingly use a variety of tools to minimize that risk. For example, fertilizer, a key part of growing crops in the Canadian prairies, and crop protection products like herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides, all intended to reduce the risk of that production. Things like insecticide seed treatments, the red coating around these seeds, once those seeds germinate and a seedling sprouts above the soil, the insecticide contained within is incorporated into that plant and helps that plant establish without being nibbled by the various crop pests. And we use genetic technologies as well to increase our productivity on the prairies. Here's some canola that has been genetically engineered to be Roundup ready, Roundup being, of course, a herbicide. And spraying herbicides without damaging the crops is essential, because herbicides are one of the most important sources of reduced yields. But this is a landscape, and this is an industry that is mechanized and computerized. You can see two combine harvesters moving across a very large set of fields. And on board, they have precision agricultural technology that has been configured to report what the yield is, and it's connected to a GPS, pinging a satellite that can describe what the yield is on every single square meter of that field. And it's at scale, as you can see here. It's a scale to maximize productivity. And I ask you, without scale, could we feed the world? This is a bulk grain carrier, and it's off taking that grain abroad. And it's not just about feeding the world. If we didn't do this intensively as we are doing, we might need twice as many Earths to feed that world. But here's where this is what I want to talk about. I want to talk about natural vegetation. And you can see here this large cropped landscape. We have very little natural vegetation, because a lot of that prairie grassland that we talked about in the poll has been removed. And it's been removed to achieve that scale. And my question for the next 10 to 15 minutes is, what if we made a small change and added some of that vegetation back, just like these aspens surrounding these wetlands in central Alberta? And what if we encouraged more perennial plants to grow near fields. And here's my message. It's all about messy fields. And I'm going to begin to start the conversation about how we might use bioecology for a bioeconomy. And the work I'm talking about today comes from my lab at the University of Calgary. It's the A, B, and C lab, the Agriculture, Biodiversity, and Conservation Lab. And I'm in the Department of Biological Sciences. When I talk about messy fields, what am I talking about? Well, let's try and understand it in terms of contrast. On the left, there are some very tidy fields, and on the right, some very messy fields. You can see on the right, there's a lot of other stuff happening in that landscape that isn't crop. Both of these images are at the same scale, but you can see on the right, there are trees. There's even a set-aside around what looks to be a creek bed. And on the left, it's just fields, many of them canola, it seems like. And what am I talking about when I talk about messy fields? I'm not talking about the fields on the right. I'm talking about somewhere that is in between these two pictures. And what might happen if we have those messy fields? And the idea is that if we have a somewhat messy field like the picture on the left, we're going to get a whole bunch of ecosystem services. And this is a term that we will talk about again throughout this morning. Pollination services, bees that might help canola and other flowering crops increase their yield, pest control, animals that move into the crop and eat the pests naturally without the use of pesticides, carbon storage in the root systems of the trees and the prairie grasses, water regulation and purification, keeping our water clean, and of course, habitat for a range of organisms. The first thing I want to talk about in terms of these ecosystem services are the animals that live here, the small animals that do a lot, the beneficial insects. And we call them beneficial because they have the potential to help crops. And a lot of what research in my lab has done to date is to look at these guys. And indeed, since between 2015 and 2020, we set out across Alberta to over 300 spots on the map, and that's these red dots on the right. And in that voyage, we discovered of over 300 species of bee. And when you think of bee, perhaps you immediately think of that yellow and black prototype, the honeybee, but there are so many more types of wild native bees in Alberta, like this green one, or this blue one, or this furry one. You could almost pet that bumblebee. And we also have the natural enemies, the ferocious beetles and spiders that eat the crop pests, like harvestmen, ground beetles, and spiders. And we found these two across the province. I'm going to show you some results from our lab. We're a science lab, and I'm going to show you some scientific results. First message is that messy fields like the ones I've described are better for bees. And here's what we discovered. We went to 21 fields across this network of places we visited, and we sampled at various distances from the edge of the field where there were trees or a wetland or some grassy bits, the messy stuff. So right at 0 meters, that's the edge of the field, and we moved into the field 25 meters, 75 meters, and we compared how many bees we got in our traps at these different locations. And that's what we have on the y-axis here. Fewer bees, more bees. And right at the edge, we got the most bees. And as we moved into the field, we got fewer and fewer bees, relatively speaking. And we interpret that as what we call a spillover effect. Just like a cup of water, when it spills, you're going to get more of that water closer to the cup than further away. We take this as evidence that those messy places, those field edges that have natural vegetation, are also home to 132 species of solitary bee. The next message I want to leave you with, this is about bioecology and its value for the bioeconomy, is that messy fields are better for natural enemies. So across those 330 sites, we found this trend that natural enemies like these beetles, drawn here by my student Tobin, they move into and out of the messy places across the season. And the message is that if you want to get these guys close to your crop where they can munch on the pests, you need more of these messy places because they're important at certain times of the year. The beetles and the spiders as well, they make this habitat on the left, the messy part at the edge of the field, provides a home for them that they depend on throughout that season. And I had a student who also was wondering if they're actually providing that ecosystem service. They might be there, but are they actually also doing something that farmers might care about? Are they helping to control the pests? So what Tobin did is they put out these plasticine caterpillars that look like caterpillars. And indeed, the beetles thought they were caterpillars. They, when we put a bunch of them in an arena, in a little enclosed terrarium with the beetles, they bit on it, and that's a bite mark right there. And indeed, when we put these caterpillars across 950 locations in 20 fields, they sure bit them as well in the field, in the crop. And the message that Tobin discovered was that these beetles bite more when they are close to the field edge. So not only are they more dependent on the edge of the field, they also do their business that farmers care about more when there's more messy places. They attack more, they're more bitey, if you like, when there's more mess. And here's the clincher, the one that I think is the most important one if we're going to convince people to change what they have on their landscape. Is there a relationship between messy fields and crop yields? And there is. If there was one, we might expect to see a pattern like this, that closer to the edge of the field, it's hotter in terms of that crop yield. We're getting more yield and less deeper in the field. And that's what it would look like in a simple quarter section or in a slightly more messy one. We get what we call a halo effect. Did we see that halo effect? Well, to do that, we had to spy. We had to spy on some farmers and their yield from space. And we did that across 757 canola fields using a technique that's increasingly being used in the industry, which is to combine satellite imagery with precision yield. That's data collected by these combine harvesters. And we built a model that allowed us to predict, basically to give a pretty good guess of what those yields are across these 757 fields in central Alberta. And we got this pattern. We got a pattern that is absolutely consistent with a yield halo. As you move, this is from right at the field edge, and this is deep into the field, and this is less yield and more yield, and this line is the average yield across the field. And somewhere about 25 meters into the field, you get this peak in yield, and then it goes back to the mean, to the average. And that's totally consistent with these halos of slightly higher yield. So these messy places, the field edges, are actually leaving an imprint, if you like, on something our farmers care about, their crop yield. And we asked further what might be causing that. And we turned out through an experiment, we showed that it was in part, not only, but partly driven by bees. This was a canola crop. We saw evidence that bees were also driving this. And of course, there are other factors too, like moisture and pest control that could be causing this yield effect. So just to bring it all together and summarize, we've got some evidence that messy fields are better for bees, they're better for natural enemies, and they support higher crop yields. But how do we make more messy fields? And that's the part I want to leave you with. And I'm working on a project right now that takes the idea that we could make more mess one field at a time. If we can find the parts of those farmers' fields, like these blue spots, that are costing the farmer money, that they spray, that they add seed, that they put inputs into, but they don't get the profit from. If we can ask them to take these bits out of production to save some money and also turn that into a messy place, it might be what we call a win-win, a win for the farmer and a win for ecosystem services. And we're doing just that through our Prairie Precision Sustainability Network. And we've got 60 farmers and over 6,000 fields already enrolled across 3 provinces. And I just want to leave you with one thought that enters into our next speaker's topic, that there are more than one way to make our landscape messy. I've talked about one way, which is to add natural vegetation back. But there's also things like intercropping. We can have 2 crops growing side by side. We can start growing perennial crops like this perennial type of wheat. Or we can breed perennial crops like perennial sunflowers. Or we can take part in the long tradition of cover cropping. All of these things can bring more ecosystem services to farmers where they are likely to benefit. And all the work here is driven by science. And if you'd like to have some of this data, I'd be happy to share it with you. 7 publications I've talked about very quickly here, and you can just email me for that. And of course, need to thank the large team that made all of this possible, my many students and other trainees, and of course, my funding from the likes of Canola Council and Ducks Unlimited and Alberta Conservation Association that has made this work possible. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul. I really enjoyed learning about the messy fields and their benefits to farming. And I have to say, when I've planted sunflowers in my own vegetable garden, I've seen bees that look like they're almost drunk trying to go from sunflower to sunflower because they've just had so much fun getting all of that beautiful stuff there. So, Paul, I have some questions for you. And the first one is from the audience. This is from Jeff Passmore. He is the chair of Scaling Up Bio, Canada's annual industrial bioeconomy business conference. And Jeff is asking, to what extent are insecticides passed through to humans?
Right. You know, I've got to be honest that I'm not an ecotoxicologist, so this is not my my area of expertise. I'm not able to give you a direct answer there, unfortunately, but I can tell you that there is some concern that pesticides are also being transferred through the plants to bees and other insects, and that's having an effect on their capacity to provide services. So there's been a large debate around insecticides such as neonics, which, as we know, are really, really essential for producing those yields. And the effect they're having on bees has actually caused them to be, if you like, regulated in Europe, at least.
Fabulous. Okay, thank you for answering that question from the audience. Please keep your questions coming. Let us know who you are, what your name is. We love hearing from you. My other question for you, Paul, is how do canola producers typically react to the idea that adding natural vegetation and perennials near their fields can positively impact yields? Do you find that they're surprised or skeptical?
Well, I think there's a general surprise that there is some yield benefit to natural areas. So yes, there's a surprise and interest, but the yield benefit, and I didn't have an opportunity to get into this into much detail, is not going to make anyone rich. There's a small benefit there that we figured out probably pays for itself. So if you add a messy area, the halo you're going to get is going to pay you back in a little bit of increased yield. But there's also some skepticism too, because farmers like to drive straight. And a lot of that is about saving money for fuel. It's also about making their job just that much easier. So there does need to be some incentive associated with making changes to your field, especially if it adds mess right in the middle.
Thank you for answering that question. Before we move on to our next guest speaker, Marcus, we're going to do another quick poll question. And the quick poll question is, what does the term bioeconomy refer to? A, an economic system based on biological resources. B, biotechnology research, application, and commercialization. C, processing of biological raw materials and organic waste, development of new value chains. D, conservation of ecosystems, promoting biodiversity and avoiding soil degradation. Or E, all of the above. And this time we're going to have 30 seconds to answer this poll question. A little less time, and please put your answers in. Okay, we have our answers. We see that 14% of participants said that the bioeconomy is an economic system based on biological resources. We see that 2% of participants believe that processing of biological raw materials and organic waste, development of new value chains. And then we have 11% think that it's all about conservation of ecosystems, promoting biodiversity, and avoiding soil degradation. And then E is all of the above. What's the answer? The answer to the Zoom poll is all of the above. So thank you for everyone who took the time to put in their responses. The concept of the bioeconomy is a broad notion that focuses on economic considerations and sustainable resource use. There are three approaches or visions of the bioeconomy. The biotechnology vision centers on genetic engineering and industrial applications. The bioresources vision emphasizes the use of biological raw materials in the formation of new biologically based supply chains, while the bioecology vision prioritizes ecological processes extending beyond traditional economic boundaries to include measures like species diversity and soil quality. I would now invite Marcus to share his presentation and explain these approaches in more detail. Please remember to type your questions in the Q&A box. When you ask your question, please tell us your name and a bit about yourself, such as your location and your profession.
Yes, hello everybody, good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation to talk here. I'd like to share some reflections and perspectives on the bioeconomy, and in particular, how the notion of bioecology relates to transformative change in agriculture. Before I move on, I would like to draw an analogy with another sector in society in terms of diffusion of technology through time, just to illustrate how lengthy many of these processes are. If we go back to the 70s and 80s, we had the notion of information technology taking place and sort of becoming familiar. And then throughout the next couple of decades, we moved into a notion of the knowledge economy, where the technology in itself was applied in many different sectors of society, and we saw the economic benefits and effects of that. So the technology moves into sort of broadens out and becomes part of the economy. And then from the 2000s on, we have moved into the so-called information society. And in recent years, in particular throughout the last year, we've seen how artificial intelligence also totally revamps, or at least potentially, many different sectors and parts of society. So the big question is then, will the same thing happen to the bioeconomy and all its sectors? Are we moving towards a biosociety? We have already been through a stage of biotechnology in the 80s and 90s, and we're currently talking about the bioeconomy. And we might also see a similar development towards a biosociety, where these technologies and solutions and applications is used in many different areas and spheres of society. But this is still, the jury on this is still out, and I guess nobody fully knows. But in general, this kind of thinking is based on in particular the works of Kondratiev and later Carlota Perez on long technological waves and their impacts on economy and society. And it is common to operate with periods of 50, 60 years for each generic technology. And in the same way that you can regard information technologies as a generic technology, you could also interpret the bioeconomy or biotechnology to be a similar kind of a generic technology, potentially being applicable to very many parts of society. What I will talk about today is partly based on a paper that I was part of, where we accomplished a literature review of the scientific literature on the bioeconomy from 2005 to 2014. And it's also partly drawing on a couple of other studies and papers that I've been part of, which relates to the bioeconomy. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but this is just to say that in the scientific literature, the notion of the bioeconomy started to get traction in mid-2000. And also that what has been written, at least until 2014, in the scientific literature was primarily based in the natural sciences, where you can see towards the bottom here, social sciences is not very well represented. I guess we should do a follow-up study to document how these developments have been in the last decade also, but that we haven't done so far. But this is just to show you that these notions that we operate with is based on going through the scientific literature on the notion of the bioeconomy, where we also had several sort of keywords that we included. So having gone through this amount of literature, we have sort of seen patterns and categorized all the literature into three different visions which constitutes different ways of perceiving the bioeconomy. Where the first vision we have termed the biotechnology vision, where one highlights and emphasizes the importance of biotechnology research in a sort of a linear innovation model, supply-based, where application and commercialization of biotechnology in various value chains and sectors becomes important and central. So that's the first vision. The second vision, before I move on, I could also give you a couple of examples of this first biotechnology vision. This could be exemplified by gene modifications for improved performance and resistance among the plants that we operate with, or products that we operate with, or it could also be synthetic meat. I guess we have all tried this out at some point, which is also a totally new way of producing food, which is more sustainable than what has been before. That's two examples sort of illustrating what this biotech vision could be. The second vision we have termed the bioresource vision. This focuses upon the processing of biological raw materials and also sort of to exploit and optimize existing value chains and also utilize existing raw materials in new ways, also across value chains, where also minimizing waste is important. Examples of this, here we have an interesting example from the western coast of Norway, where you use larvae which eat themselves their way through household waste, and by doing that they upgrade themselves into salmon fodder, which is an important industry along the western coast of Norway and in Norway in general. Another example from Oslo, where I'm based, is a company called Gruten, which transforms coffee grounds to oyster mushrooms, which is then delivered to local restaurants, and which also illustrates this kind of utilizing rest raw materials in both existing and new value chains. And then the third vision we have termed the bioecology vision, and which is also the topic for today, which refers to the conservation of ecosystems, where also reduction of energy use and notion of biodiversity or intercropping is central, and also where that focuses upon avoiding monocultures and soil degradation. So this vision is also more sort of trying to go back to a mode following the sort of logics of nature itself, I would say, and in that sense being also more radical than the two first visions. Examples of this last and third bioecology vision is urban farming or rooftop gardens. It could also be through other forms of urban or community-based farming, like community gardens or community farms, or vertical indoor farming, which also illustrates that alternative ways of producing plants that can be turned into food, and which could sort of complement and supplement existing value chains that are more traditional. Another example is also direct sales from local food producers, where the consumer arranges and sort of agrees upon amounts of food to buy with the producers directly on Facebook typically, and then all buyers and producers meet at some point of time, and food is sort of delivered from the producer to the consumer. And this phenomenon is sort of growing. In Norway, we have, I think it is around 170 sort of circles of both producers and consumers across the entire country. So this is also a growing phenomenon that is also part of this, could also illustrate this kind of local food production, which is also an alternative to these established global value chains, which is a dominant mode in agriculture and food production internationally. So we have these three visions of the bioeconomy, which then sort of sums up different ways of perceiving and focusing and talking about the and understanding the bioeconomy. So in relation to the first question in the poll, I would also say that well, we operated with the right answer was all of the above, but it's also fine that people sort of focus upon one or the other. But I think the central point here is also that to be aware that people have different viewpoints and perspectives. And so I think part of the challenge here is also to acknowledge this diversity, that we're talking about different things under the broader umbrella of the notion of the bioeconomy. So I think that the challenge is partly to understand this diversity, and also then that is a key prerequisite in order to move on, so to speak, to find common ground and to search for joint solutions. So I would also like to go somewhat more into depth into this last bioecology vision, and to understand how that relates to transformative change before I wrap up. And that I'll do by introducing this figure, which is a very widely known and acknowledged sort of way to perceive the world within innovation studies, at least, and the transition studies. And this is called the MLP, the multi-level perspective, developed by Frank Giels and colleagues, and which consists of 3 levels. You have the niche level, which is the sort of the new technologies, new solutions, challenging existing regimes in the middle, which are socio-technical, consisting of both technologies, but also social structures, practices, values, ways of, and value chains, and what have you, and policies, regulations, exist different industries and sectors. And then we have also landscape developments, which are more slow processes, sort of exerting pressures on existing value chains and industries and sectors. An example of a landscape development here is, of course, climate change and the need for more sustainable solutions, which opens up sort of questioning existing practices in existing socio-technical regimes and systems. So here you could say that, of course, the notion of the bioeconomy in itself could be seen as a niche, sort of entering into the discourse and opening up for problematizing and reflecting upon existing practices and industry and value chains and industries, how we're doing things. But we could also have a more nuanced approach, which utilizes our 3 visions. And if we do that, I would argue that both the biotech vision and the bioresource vision is very much sort of based upon existing or in line with existing modes of thinking, which relates to innovation having a primary objective of job creation and economic growth, where sustainability is obviously also a concern, but often subordinate to job creation and economic performance. And then I would say that the bioecology vision, like I was mentioning earlier, represents a more radical alternative way of thinking, which sort of questions some of the basic foundations and principles of current value chains in the sectors that are the dominant ones within the notion of the bioeconomy. Yeah. And then we could say a few words about how policy can support these transformative processes. And in our field, it's common to operate with 4 characteristics or notions relating to directionality, meaning that you give these existing value chains, practices, industries, some kind of direction. Policy states various kinds of goals. For instance, a reduction of CO2 within a specific time frame within the so-called mission-oriented innovation policy framework, where Mariana Mazzucato has been central. In addition to directionality, we have demand, where public sector or different kinds of organizations could also sort of apply and implement demand, commissioning of different new solutions that draws in the same directions that policy wants to move. And then we have the notion of coordination. These kinds of processes in transformative change often requires many different types of actors and sectors to communicate and to interact. And therefore, it's also a big challenge to coordinate these different actors and the different voices or visions, what have you. Finally, a notion of reflexivity. These processes of transformative change are often seen as open-ended. We don't always know where we are ending. So we need to evaluate and monitor and learn throughout the processes and to adjust the course along the way. So these are 4 key characteristics and policy needs in order to arrive at transformative change, which is also widely acknowledged within this community of transition studies and innovation studies. Finally, in addition to those kinds of policies, sort of setting direction, priorities, and also stimulating demand in those directions and ensuring coordination and reflexivity along the way, you could also operate with a notion of destabilization of existing regimes, which is also seen as very important. As if you have a neutral policy towards these change processes, that will often de facto favor existing actors, as these often possess more resources, more connections, more networks, and better knowledge of how the system works, etc. So often in practice, a neutral policy would imply sort of an advantage for existing value chains and existing incumbents and actors. So regimes destabilization is also seen as a key factor in order to arrange for these processes of transformative change. And then it's also welcome to interpret how that might look in the domain of the bioeconomy in general, and also within agriculture in particular. So with that, I'll wrap up. I have tried to say a few words about the notion of the bioeconomy, that this is a broad and emerging policy field, and that the discourse around the bioeconomy is fragmented. It encompasses various visions that we have pointed at. In practice, these visions, of course, coexist and also compete. I guess this is politics, and these are strong interests involved, of course. So not easy to maneuver across these different perspectives. And you could also say that 2 of these visions, the biotech visions and the bioresource vision, focuses on improving performance of existing value chains, whereas the bioecology vision more questions existing practices and value chains and represents a more profound alternative to existing structures. And finally, transformative innovation policies require concerted action across sectors and sciences, which might look nice and easy, but in practice, it doesn't always prove to be that easy. So that was what I intended to say. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you so much, Marcus, for your fascinating presentation. I'm going to check out those coffee ground mushrooms. They sound very interesting. But first, I have a question for you. How can policymakers facilitate a transition towards the bioeconomy in various sectors?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that there are many ways that policymakers can arrange for this kind of transitions, and also reflecting then the different visions that are presented. I think that I mean, you have a large portfolio of tools going from research, stimulating research and development, You could stimulate networks and arenas for interactions, or you could also launch more transformative policies and induce more direction into these systems through, for instance, innovative public procurement, where the public sector can ask for solutions that don't exist. So I think that there are many different types of policies you can apply here, and I think that also it is quite key that I think you said that how can they sort of ensure this kind of transition in various sectors. I think that it's also key for policymakers to ensure this kind of coordination across sectors in the first place, in order to align different kinds of actors and sectors and ensure that we are speaking about the same thing, and at least acknowledge that we have different perspectives within this larger debate. So that's an attempt at an answer.
Thank you very much for that answer, Marcus. And now we're going to move on to the panel discussion. I want to thank both of you for your excellent presentation. And if there's time at the end, we'll take another couple of questions from the audience as well. So please make sure to put those questions in the chat and upvote the ones you'd like to see our panelists address. We really want to know who you are, and we want to have a sense of where you're coming from. So let us know. So Paul, my first question is for you. Do you feel we're doing a good job of measuring the benefits of ecosystem services for farmers? Do you have ideas about how we can track the impacts of landscape modification on agricultural productivity?
Yeah, I think we could be doing so much more in this regard, and it's important that we do so, because I really do believe, and I think some of the research I presented and research by others, particularly in Europe, demonstrates that there are win-wins out there, wins for the farmers and livelihoods, and wins for ecosystem services that in turn feed back and help the farmers, and of course ecosystem services that help society in general. So I think that we really must do that. We must determine and develop a business case for valuing the ecosystem services in the agricultural business model. It's certainly not my expertise to do that, but I hope that the work that I present today and the work that we're doing begins to start demonstrating to those who are in that field they can actually, there is something to value in terms of ecosystem services effects on crops.
Marcus, do you want to add any comments to this question before I move on to another question for you?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, so Marcus, this question for you is, how open are farmers to policies that promote bioecology on farms in Europe?
That's hard for me to answer. I have been studying both the scientific literature and policy documents in this regard. I have not been speaking to farmers, so I wouldn't know.
Okay.
But based on experience from innovation studies, I could say that it would be natural that many existing players and actors in this domain would be skeptical towards these new practices and new solutions. That would be something that I expect from incumbent actors and existing actors within sort of existing structures and industries and value chains. So, but of course, then again, you have some actors that are more proactive and more willing to experiment and more eager to explore these and believe in these possibilities. So that's a general remark on these kinds of dynamics across newcomers and incumbents that I would also expect to happen here.
So there, Marcus, there's definitely skepticism that there might be among European farmers. How do they respond well to policy changes? How, I mean, is your sense, just even from reading the news, is there going to be people up in arms? I mean, because I know that, you know, thinking about Alberta and the prairies, you bring in a policy change and the government says you need to change how you do this. That's not going to necessarily be welcomed.
No, no, absolutely. I wouldn't expect them to sort of jump on this right away. And I guess also what we have seen is that there is a lot of talk about these new transformative possibilities and visions in the bioeconomy strategies in different Nordic countries that I've been studying. Whereas when we have been looking at actual policy instruments and actual policy, that has been more lacking. So it seems that this is still sort of being introduced in terms of these kinds of sustainable solutions being talked about and strategized, but they haven't manifested themselves and been implemented in practice yet. And I guess that also relates to existing interests being skeptical.
Okay, I have another question. This is for both panelists, but I'm going to start with you first, Paul. This is from Mark Redmond, CEO of Radar, Results-Driven Agricultural Resource in Edmonton. Mark asks, is the challenge to adopting these better practices more scientific evidence or psychological interventions? Meeting with farmers in person to change? He says, I am not sure that farmers psychologically like messes. Neat and tidy is built into the farmer's psyche.
Yes, of course. Yeah, no, so it's absolutely. There's definitely needs for both the scientific and let's call it the sociological piece as well, and also the actual on the ground grassroots changes. And there are organizations that I'm involved with that really understand that it needs to have the science piece and it also needs to have the grassroots piece. Because farmers that I meet really are, they are like scientists on their own land. They appreciate the evidence base to support their decisions. But they're also receptive to the sort of the grassroots, the cultural messaging. And I think it needs to be both. It needs to be both. And it doesn't just need to be economic incentives. There also needs to be sort of changes in, you need to see what your neighbors are doing. Great question.
Marcus, do you want to answer that as well? And then I have another question.
I fully agree. These processes are both technical and they are social. We are currently changing our minds and our values, but these are slow processes.
Okay, we love getting these questions in from the audience. This is from Jim Jenkins at Nutrien, Agricultural Products Risk and Sustainability. Jim is asking, are there regions where bioecology is dominant or practiced to some extent? What are the results? Who would like to jump into this one, please?
I can briefly say that it's certainly there's much more evidence. There's much more support, I guess, in European systems for introducing more nature closer to the fields. There's all sorts of examples across Europe, UK, France, Germany, as well, that where we're bringing more nature closer to the fields, and that has a great positive effect. I can stop there.
Marcus, do you want to add anything? I think that some of the Nordic countries are taking steps also that proves willing to experiment, like Finland, Sweden. They have established these bioeconomy programs with a lot of funding, exploring new ways of working, new ways for policy to work in this domain also.
And we have another question from the audience. This is for both of you. If you'd like to respond, it's from Peter Polkowski, a chemist in Calgary. He asks, what is the impact on prices of the types of revised ag that you identify? Who would like to answer this?
I can't talk about prices, unfortunately. That's beyond my remit. Do you have anything to add there, Marcus?
No, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I don't dare.
Oh, and we have one for Paul. This is from Jason Bradley from Olds, Alberta. He's building his consulting practice in regenerative agriculture. And Jason asks, why wouldn't we want to create an anthropomorphic instance of messy fields through the implementation of regenerative agricultural practices under the 6-3-4 framework within and across the entire crop field?
I think we absolutely would. I think regenerative agriculture is just one more tool, and a very important one, increasingly important one, getting a lot of uptake, particularly in the prairies. It's another tool to add perenniality, to bring ecosystem services closer to fields. It's all good all the time, and it's a language that increasingly farmers are excited about hearing.
Super.
I fully support that. And I can also briefly mention that in addition to the examples I said, Norway and Denmark have also introduced these missions on agri-future in Denmark and sustainable feed in Norway, which is also a way for government to point out the direction societal goals to be achieved, which I think also believe in this domain.
We have another question. Do you think researchers and government are doing a good job of promoting the positive impacts of agriculture for ecosystems and climate action? We'll start with you first, Marcus.
The government, which government are you talking about? Is that in general, or?
I think it's in general. So it's talking about researchers and government in general. Are they doing a good job of promoting the positive impacts of agriculture for ecosystems and climate action from your experience?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. There are many good initiatives going on, but I think that you could always be bolder, and that goes for both government and research, I guess.
And what do you think, Paul?
Yes, government, we need, government isn't necessarily going to be received very well, particularly in Canadian prairies. Too much intervention has traditionally not been overly welcomed, but we need to think about developing policy instruments that actually incentivize change for those farmers that are prepared to make those changes.
Fabulous. Okay, so let's see here. One more, how could better communication between actors across the value chain make a difference to the sustainability of agriculture?
You're talking about communications, and that's important, but
yes.
But I think that also coordination for a start is also an interaction is also equally important as communications, and I guess the overlapping, but also to ensure that the various types of actors come together in various ways to discuss and negotiate ways forward. As I've shown, this is a very broad domain, and we need to clarify what we're talking about. So I think both communications and coordination is very, very important.
I'm being asked that we want to hear Marcus give an example about what's happening in Europe. And are there any examples of coordination that you feel comfortable talking about?
I can just mention a couple of bioeconomy panels that we have come across in some of our work in Denmark and Finland, ensuring what I'm saying, ensuring that different kinds of actors and societal stakeholders come together, and that you ensure different voices to be heard in these processes of developing policies and strategies for the bioeconomy.
Super. Paul, do you want to say anything before I wrap things up?
No, I think I'll say one thing is that Honey Nut Cheerios have helped incentivize more mess on landscapes. So there's an example of how the value chain can feed back to something beneficial for ecosystem services. Well,
thank you so much, Paul and Marcus, for sharing your knowledge with us today. And to our participants, you will receive a post-event survey and a registration link for the next online panel discussion on February 15th about innovation, agriculture, and biotechnology. Please also go to the simpsoncenter.ca website and subscribe to hear more about upcoming events and receive our monthly newsletter for information based on research about Canadian food production. Thank you very much for joining us today.